They're very suspicious of secular and moderate Muslims, and they're giving them a hard time. And yet the left in the West has been largely silent. So I think it's a combination of racism and anti-Semitism, and I think some of the racism too is part of a colonial hangover, the Orientalist sort of view of the Middle East. And it also comes from, I think, an anti-Western, anti-American agenda that after the Second World War, after the Holocaust, as states became decolonized and countries became independent, the left became, I think, critical of the United States as it became a superpower and influenced Western Europe. And it was also opposed to colonialism. So any sort of intervention by the West in the struggles of decolonizing people, and the Palestinians being one and the slowest evolving one, that they didn't want to be intervened critically, and I think they should have intervened critically many times.
Let me put a theory to you that I've been thinking about actually for a number of years, and I'll tell you the story of how it sort of emerged for me. When I was the editor of the Jerusalem Post, I had a chance to interview the fellow whose name escapes me, but he was then the EU ambassador, the European Commission's ambassador to Israel. And I said, why is it that we hear nonstop from the European Union that Israel has to end its occupation of the West Bank, of Gaza, but we never hear from the European Union that Syria has to end its occupation of Lebanon? Why is it that when 53 Palestinians are killed in Jenin, it is a major event in European politics, but when 50,000 people are killed in Darfur, it is a comparatively minor event? I offered a few instances of that. And he said something that stayed with me. He said, you see, you Israelis, including me as an Israeli, you Israelis, you're one of us. Our expectations are higher for you than they are for, say, Cambodians or Colombians. I remember being really very struck by the comment. First of all, the racism involved vis-a-vis Cambodians or Colombians, but I also thought what was telling about the comment was the idea that more is expected of Jews, which harks back to a comment that was once made, I think, by the philosopher Eric Hoffer, who said that Israelis are the only country on earth that is expected to behave like a Christian nation. Now, it seems to me that something is at play here which is actually quite ancient, and I'm wondering what your take on it is. Part of the reason why Christian anti-Semitism has been so sustained, so powerful, is that Christ offered his dispensation first to the Jews, and the Jews turned him down. So, I mean, it came later to to Europe and the rest of the world, but the Jews were the first ones who were given this gift, and they turned it down. Then, sort of moving ahead a couple of thousand years, there were these wonderful expectations put on Israel. You remember Jerusalem of gold, the kibbutzim movement, a kind of socialist paradise. And after 1967, Israel disappointed all of those expectations. It became more laissez-faire in its economic outlook. It took over the West Bank and Gaza. It got itself involved in sort of the muck and mire of geopolitics. So Israel sort of was given the opportunity to be different, and it disappointed those expectations. And in a way, that's a kind of parable of the fallen angel. That's to say, it's satanic in a sense. You don't really expect moral behavior from beasts. And if you think of, say, the Sudanese as beasts, well, you don't expect moral behavior. That's just sort of what the Sudanese do. They go and kill Darfuris, or they kill their southern citizens, and so on. But more is expected of the Jews. Now, is that, I mean, is that a crazy theory on my part?
No, I think you touch on something very important. And I would say for a strand of anti-Semitism always said are always claims that, if only the Jews would, the world would be saved. So if only Israel changed, or if only Israel didn't exist, there'd be peace in the world. When religion was the way of seeing the world, the Christians used to argue, or the anti-Semitic Christians would argue, that only if the Jews would accept Christ, everything would be okay. When race and biology and nationalism became the way of seeing the world, the Europeans were fascinated by the fact that only if the Jews would be eradicated, eliminated, or removed, then everything would be okay. And I think now the strand is that if Israel would change, or if Israel disappears, then everything will be okay. And I think this is why it's so important for people, for moderate Muslims and people in the West to really begin to understand the language of Islamicism, because the thing about anti-Semitism, and I think that the demonization of Israel and holding Israel to double standards is a form of anti-Semitism. I wrote on this very issue with Ed Kaplan, a colleague at Yale, and we showed unequivocally that there's a very profound link between traditional classical anti-Semitism and what we call Israel bashing. We don't call it anti-Zionism, but extraordinarily harsh criticism of Israel is very much linked to traditional anti-Semitism. In fact, we found that of the people that bashed Israel excessively, they were 13 times more likely to be anti-Semitic than the average population in 10 European countries. So it's off the charts. So there is this belief that if only Israel changes, or only if Israel is gone, that everything will be okay. But the thing about anti-Semitism and Israel bashing is that anti-Semitism starts with Jews, but it never ends with Jews. And Europe and nations in which got rid of its Jews always end up in dire straits, and other people, many other people, are often caught in this cancerous...
Could you say, just to interrupt you briefly,
Sure.
anti-Zionism starts with Zionists but never ends with Zionists?
Right. So to say...
Well,
yeah.
It ends with, from anti-Zionism,
Right.
you get anti-Semitism, and then you get...
Right. Right. So, and so the whole sort of notion of when this thing happened in Jenin, I remember watching CNN, and they were calling, Jenin was a Holocaust, literally. The Palestinian public spokesperson, Arakat, and others were calling it a Holocaust. It turned out that 53 people died. The vast majority of the people who died were combatants engaging with the IDF. There's this type of imagery. There's the Nazification of Israel that's occurring, and there's also Holocaust denial, which is rampant in the Middle East, and it's also re-emerging in Europe and other parts of the West. And in a sense, Holocaust denial is repugnant because it's almost it's committing another Holocaust on the memory of the Jewish people. So when Ahmadinejad and the Islamicists claim that the Jews are swindling money from the Europeans, from reparations, and this is just sort of a conspiracy to create the state of Israel, and that the Israelis and the Jews are swindling Europeans, this is just an eradication of the memory of the Jewish people, and using the Holocaust as a weapon to fight the state of Israel and the Jewish people. So it's a nasty form of anti-Semitism.
So, I mean, since I think we've managed to depress everyone in the audience totally, what do we do about this?
What we do about it, I think, Elie Wiesel was at Yale last year, and he spoke at the law school, and it was a packed audience. And Elie Wiesel spoke about how the suicide bomber was being elevated to a national level, i.e. With Iran, and that he was extraordinarily worried about the possibility of another Holocaust. And for me and for some of my colleagues watching Elie Wiesel, who's not only the symbol of a survivor of the Holocaust, but also I think he's a wise man, scholar, intellectual in the greatest tradition of some of the Hasidic rabbis, and he's a man that worked for human rights all over the world, trying to narrow the gap between being a bystander and watching injustice. I think he's an extraordinary man. And here he was, a survivor, talking about the possibility in his lifetime of another Holocaust, of Israel being hit by a nuclear bomb. And he went on to say, and it was very disturbing to see him speak about this, and then he went on to say that the thing that really disturbs him, the thing that really bothers him, is that nobody's doing anything. And that the Jewish community, Western leaders, academics, scholars, the human rights community has really been silent on this issue. And it was an extraordinary moment at the law school to hear Elie Wiesel say this for me. I had a similar conversation with Natan Sharansky also about a year ago in Israel. I was part of the student struggle for Soviet Jewry, and in 1984, I was in Moscow visiting I met his family, and he was in solitary confinement on a hunger strike at the time. And he said that when he was on the hunger strike, he knew that one day he'd be free in Jerusalem. And he knew he'd be free in Jerusalem in his lifetime because, as he put it, the students of Western Europe and North America and the Jewish housewives were on the streets marching. And he also said, Charles, why is nobody doing anything in the United States, in Canada, and Western Europe on this issue? And this is an issue that not only confronts Israel and the Jewish people, it's an affront to everything that people believe in terms of human rights and liberal social democracy. So I would say that we need to educate ourselves on the language of Islamicism, what their agenda is, what they're trying to do, and to start to, in every way we can, from writing our politicians to writing op-ed pieces to educating our classes to educating our community, to begin to create a program to confront this issue, which I believe is the most serious issue confronting the Jewish people and Western democracy in our lifetime. And
It seems to me, I mean, I agree with what you say, but it seems to me that a lot of our thinking about this matter is clouded because we say the answer to the Ahmadinejads of the world is tolerance. And in fact, on the anniversary of Kristallnacht, it was just the 70th anniversary 3 weeks ago, the European Parliament hosted a meeting of European Jewish leaders who actually met with some representatives from Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, a number of other Muslim countries. And they were going to agree to this, what they call a white paper on combating anti-Semitism and racism and other forms of intolerance, which on the surface sounded like it was a real breakthrough. Now, at the same time that this was happening, the UN General Assembly is debating a resolution that would urge defamation of religion as a punishable or taboo activity. It would prescribe it. Now, it seemed to me that under the banner of tolerance, all kinds of things could happen. One of the things that could happen is that the conversation that you and I have just been having could be banned because we are speaking about Islam, or at least Islamism, in ways that some Islamists might take offense to, say we are defaming their religion, and there might even be a UN General Assembly resolution to back them. And that's hugely worrisome. We have to have kind of open conversations about what is happening with Hamas, with Iran, among Muslim scholars in a way that is unblinkered, and where you can sort of have these kinds of conversations. I mean, tolerance seems to me a very weak rubric under which to fight this particular battle. In fact, intolerance is probably a much better one. You have to define the boundaries of what is acceptable and what is not, what hatreds nobody will stand for, who is considered kind of outside the realm of civilized conversation and isn't worth talking to. In that sense, I was very troubled by Ahmadinejad's invitation to Columbia University, which you mentioned. This is in September of 2007, which is to say that everyone is, in effect, admitted to the court of public opinion. Everyone can have his soapbox for a day, particularly if that everyone happens to be a country of the president of an important country. Now, this isn't, I don't think, the kind of thing that Columbia would have extended, I hope, to a David Duke or to a Louis Farrakhan or to any number of race baiters and anti-Semites, because we do recognize that some people really should fall outside